Hi, everyone. I'm John Doring, and this is the X. It's NMRA X, the place where model railroaders and railroad modelers and all of us who are crazy about trains come together to share ideas, insights, and inspirations. Remember, you heard it on the X. Our next presenter has been quite interested in passenger trains, modeling these mostly in HO since before the Amtrak era. He's currently president of the Hub Division, that's the Boston area, of the Northeastern region of the NMRA. And he's also the superintendent of track at the Seashore Trolley Museum in Kennebunkport, Maine. So please help me to welcome now James Van Bokkelen.
Hello, everybody. I'm presenting on New England passenger trains, which is, as John said, a subject that I've been working on for a long time. I really came of age as a modeler, started to develop my skills and be able to use tools like airbrushes and so forth in the 70s. And at that time, the publications I read, Model Railroader, Railroad Model Craftsman, there was a lot of good research going on about freight cars. I knew that a lot of what I'd gotten in previous years, a lot of what was available on the market, wasn't very good looking when you looked at it up close and wasn't always labeled properly or lettered properly for a given period. But with that research going on, I knew that I was going to be able to put a good-looking freight train in the scenes on whatever layout I managed to build in the future. And my particular interest was the Boston and Maine Railroad. I was a member of the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society. They had a lot of good publications coming out. Their B&M Bulletin had a lot of good information in it. And I knew what the trains I wanted to see looked like. And for a kind of odd sidestep, I didn't want them to look like the trains I'd grown up riding. Those trains were just about all Bud RDCs, and they ran in commuter service around Boston. What interested me about the B&M and about New England railroading in general was, maybe 10, 15 years before my first train ride. It was when steam locomotives were still in use, when the Boston and Maine handled trains that went to Montreal and New York State and New Brunswick up to St. John. And there were cars on the Boston and Maine from the Canadian Pacific, from the New Haven, from the Pennsy. All these passenger cars handled in all kinds of very interesting services. None of them very long, not the spectacular long-distance hauls through the Midwest or over the desert, but very interesting to me. And so I sat down to research how I would be able to model these when the time came that I could have a layout. So I've written somewhat about this subject. I have a New England Railroad history and modeling page, and there I've written up a good deal of what I know about the interline passenger trains, about the mail service routes, about the equipment of 4 railroads that cooperated on a lot of these services. And I have an article on the Hub Division's own member articles area, which is a much longer version of why I research and model passenger trains, as I've just been telling you. And then I had one little publication in the B&M Railroad Historical Society's Modeler's Notes, which is, by the way, available on CD from the B&M RRHS. If you want to have a full collection, it's not very expensive. So what else? What else did I use while I was trying to come to this level of knowledge? There's some good online resources out there. A man named Jim Dufour has been keeping up to date a Remembering the Rutland page for, probably more than 20 years. And he has some very good data on the Rutland's passenger service, which also had that interline facet to it. All of their long-haul passenger trains originated on some other railroad, ran across the Rutland, and then went on towards some city much larger than any of those in Vermont. Second on this page, I give the URL for my own New England Railroad history and modeling page. Third, if you're modeling this era and you're modeling passenger trains in this era, many railroads operated overnight sleeper services. They did that almost always with cars either owned or operated by the Pullman Company. And Tom Madden and a host of people supporting him have researched the Pullman Company records in great detail, and that information is available via the pullmanproject.com. And that will help you identify what Pullman sleepers you might have had running on what services on any given train, on any given line. Fourth here, we have the New Haven Railroad, which was the single biggest passenger hauler in the New England states, with a very busy service between Boston and New York City, hourly first-class trains. Not all first class, only a few of them were all parlor car. But the hourly service ran to a high standard until late in the decline of the New Haven Railroad. And they have a site with information on it, and then they have discussion groups that are hosted by the Historical Technical Association. And both of those are pretty active, and there's a lot of information to be found there. The Boston and Maine Railroad discussion takes place on a list. This was originally hosted on groups.io. groups.yahoo.com, and then it moved to groups.io as Yahoo reduced their interest in hosting groups. It's a very good place to look back through the archives, which happily are public. I also am aware of a number of B&M groups on Facebook, but I am not so aware of New Haven or Maine Central or Rutland, because Facebook there's a lot of information coming through, and I find that I'd much rather spend the time modeling than keeping track of the next picture that someone posts. I go and look every once in a while. Third, we have, actually this is sixth, we have the B&M Railroad Historical Society. They have a big collection of B&M paper hosted at the University of Lowell in Massachusetts, and they have people actively working on digitizing that paper, and they also have a collection of physical artifacts, and they're associated with maintaining the B&M 060 steam engine 410 that is displayed in Lowell next to the Lowell trolley line, which serves the Lowell National Historical Park, which is worth visiting if you're interested in New England mill cities. Finally, we have the 470 Railroad Club, which has a very strong effort to preserve B&M and Maine Central equipment. Their focus is on railroads in Maine, and they're doing so at the Conway Scenic Railroad. They're responsible for a couple of B&M F7s, a Maine Central 280, and several other pieces of equipment, but they aren't very online focused. If you're interested in Maine railroads and can actually get to Maine when the virus allows you to, it would be worth looking up the 470 Club and seeing what they're doing. And if you have skills, you might be able to get involved with their work up at the Conway Scenic Railroad. So as things compare to some other railroads, there's a good deal of information about the New England railroads available, possibly because people were willing to publish books, people collected photos, they knew one another. The photo collections have been available to the various researchers, and also because the internet was stronger in New England early on than it has been in some other places. So with those resources, you can also buy books. And I've mentioned the B&M Bulletin and the Modeler's Notes. Dave Sweetland did a good overview of New England freight and passenger equipment that was published, I think, now about 15 or 20 years ago, but it still can be found as used books. The New Haven Railroad Historical Technical Association publishes a magazine called Shoreliner, which is well researched and well edited. That is something that I am very glad I've been a member of their organization for as long as I have. The Passenger Equipment Diagram book is a reprint that they did years ago, and I don't think they have reissued it. Then we have Mainline Modeler magazine, which has been gone for a number of years, but I believe you can still get their passenger car articles collected in that book, the Best of Mainline Modelers passenger car articles. And that's very useful because it has several articles focusing on Pullmans of that era and talking about how you can model something that hasn't been offered commercially. Reinforcing that, you have the Railway Prototype Cyclopedia, where volumes 1 and 2 were heavily focused on the Pullmans, the physical characteristics, the information about where they operated, and how the Pullman fleet evolved. Then in volume 5, they discuss the U.S. Army troop sleepers from World War II. And they're important in New England because, let's see, New Haven, New York Central, Boston and Maine, and Bangor and Aroostook all purchased used troop sleepers after the end of the war and converted them into a whole variety of different kinds of equipment. The Bangor and Aroostook, in fact, turned theirs into cabooses. Then the express boxcars in volume 6, they are important when you look at head-end traffic, how the express and mail moved when it was just being stored, not being sorted, and also the express reefers. One of the important traffics on the Boston and Maine Central coming down from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick was fish and express reefers. Now, most of you probably, if you're interested in this subject, know about Bob's photo. Bob Lillestrand has published photo books, mostly black and white, of both New England Railroad equipment and Pennsylvania Railroad passenger equipment. Many of them include rosters. They all include as wide a variety of photos as he can come up with. And that is very useful because Pennsylvania, its freight cars went everywhere and they were the biggest fleet in the country. Likewise, their passenger cars went offline in all directions, including through New England. Then there have been 3 good books focusing on the New Haven Railroad passenger fleet and its trains, the trains it operated in, and 1 covering all the passenger trains of northern New England with a focus on the lightweight cars and the equipment used after World War II. A final resource is if you have a particular area you're interested in, there are I don't know how many have been published now, so such and such place in color, or trackside around Boston with Joe Blow, that kind of thing. Those photos tend to be pretty well chosen by people who know their subject and they give a diverse coverage of the railroad and location involved, and they may be you may find them useful for passenger modeling, but they aren't so focused on it that I'd make a strong buy recommendation for any of them. There are also the instruction and data sheets in the kits and models that I'm going to be talking about. Then we have the old and rare kind of information, the stuff that you have to go to used book dealers and train shows. Probably most of you know about the official guide of the railways. It was monthly, and it had every passenger timetable, most freight-only timetables listing the stations for the entire United States, Canada, and Mexico, plus shipping and airline. That is a best reference if you can't get a specific timetable for the area and railroad that you're interested in. The official register of passenger train equipment, that is the passenger equivalent of the official register of railway equipment, and it lists everything. Not a lot of detail about it, but you have car numbers and you have dimensions. It's harder to find. Some of them have been scanned. Then you have timetables. They're the obvious way to know what the passenger trains were doing. The exotic things that people were not, these were very hard to access until, say, the past 10, 15 years when scanners started to be widely available. Passenger train consist books. A railroad of significant size would have a list of what kind of passenger trains were needed for every train. Passenger cars, rather, were needed for every train, and those would change from timetable to timetable. And sometimes they had specific car names or numbers. Sometimes they were just a class of car. But if you want to know what was in a train as its regular consist, there's that. The diagram books are like freight and locomotive diagram books. They have dimensions, they have weights, they have sometimes the rebuild history. They're very useful for figuring out more about a car that you found out from the official register of passenger train equipment. Then for the details of the operation, people have been coming up with conductors, engineers, and operators' personal logbooks. And the B&M Bulletin has published a number of them, and there are a number of others that have been scanned and can be found. And they'll give the specific consist for a day, the day that engineer or conductor worked that train. And they'll list the passengers on, passengers off, special cargo handled, any kind of special moves. So those are really the mother lode for what happened on a train. So then we have, how do you achieve these cars? The easiest ones, as I mentioned, are the ones you can buy from Walthers, for instance, ready to run. The B60 passenger baggage and express car from Pennsylvania. That I've seen on pictures of Santa Fe trains in California. They ran into Canada. They were everywhere. Likewise, the R50B express refrigerator, you'll often see that distinctive shape on the head end of a passenger train that hauled express. The troop sleeper I show here is a New York Central conversion with a sliding door. The New Haven did a sliding door also, but they did a recessed door. And those you can just buy off the shelf from Walthers. And then you have the Pullman heavyweight sleepers. If what you need is one of the types that Branch Line or now Atlas offered, or the Walthers offerings, frequently you can just use that car as it is, or you might have to change the name on it. And they generally are pretty good. The one thing there is that you're getting into cars which have minimum radius requirements, and without modification, a branch line kit needs 30 inches radius or more. You can modify it to get down to about 28. And the ones that are shipped pre-built by Atlas, I think, are modified for smaller than that, but that affects the underbody detailing. Pennsylvania P70 coaches also operated on through services. This is a rebuild with air conditioning I made from an old Eastern Car Works kit, but you can also buy them from, I think Bokkelen has them, and I don't know if there's another good P70 in HO. I believe there's a P70 in N. To the right of that, we have the branch line single window coach now offered by Atlas. The New York Central and Rutland bought them new, and the B&M bought them used from the New York Central. And there's a New Haven class, which you have to know New Haven pretty well to be able to tell the branch line model from the actual New Haven car. Then we have, happily for New England modelers, this American Flyer style of coach in the lower left. They were built as lightweights and air-conditioned luxury cars in the mid to late 1930s. And that common body style was shared by the B&M, the New Haven, and the Bangor and Aroostook. And they ran all over New England. I think there were some other similar body styles sold by Osgood Bradley to railroads down south, but I don't know how close. This model is a Rapido. Rapidos offered them ready to run, but they're also kits. And the Rapido model it also operates well, and out of the box, it's a pretty reasonable car. Another Rapido model on this view is the Canadian National 1954 coach. Those and some of the Canadian National sleepers were seen operating from Montreal to New York via the Connecticut River, and Montreal to Boston via the Connecticut River and Concord, New Hampshire. And they're also nice, ready to run. My third set of ready to run slides, we have a Penzi P54, PB54 combine, and an MB, that should be MB54, sorry, RPO baggage. They were all bought used by the Boston and Maine in 1940, and they ran into the mid-50s in mostly commuter service, but they were used for the local passengers' car on many long-haul trains. Then I show one of the early 50s Railway Express Corporation built for the purpose express reefers, and a red caboose Pennsylvania Railroad X29 kit that was purchased decorated as an express service car, which in that era meant different brakes. The brakes were set up for passenger train, different grab irons, and hardware under the door for access. And that kind of car would not be seen in a freight train because they'd have to mess around with its brakes to move it that way. Then we have the Bud rail diesel car. That is a Proto 1000, which has been offered by Walthers after Lifelike sold out to them. And some people have said very negative things about Bud RDCs, but they actually were the B&M passenger service I grew up with. It was all RDC by the time I rode a train. And so they have a place in my heart, but the operations of that era were, the 60s, were much less interesting to me than the 50s. So going back to the 50s on the right there is a kit which was offered by Bethlehem Car Works for the Reading coaches, the arch roof standard steel coaches that had been the Reading bought in the 20s. And the B&M and the Main Central both bought second-hand coaches from the Reading as its passenger service declined to replace wood cars that the Public Utilities Commission said were no longer safe. That I built from the kit, but those cars have also been imported, I think assembled in China and imported by Intermountain, painted and ready to go for Boston and Maine. I don't know if they've done any lettered with Main Central, but in that era, the Main Central paint scheme was exactly the same as the B&M, so all you have to do is change the lettering. And my fourth page of Ready to Run, we're actually fairly lucky here in New England for what you can just buy. Rapido has been very busy working with the New Haven Historical Technical Association, and they have done coaches in a lot of different paint schemes and with different skirts. They have done 2 variants of the parlor cars, and they're talking about bringing in the diners. And so if you really want to see, the Bay State or the Merchants Limited barreling through your little town on the shoreline, yep, you can do it. Next to that, I have one of the combines that as it came out of the box from Bethlehem Car Works in Intermountain. The bottom row is 2 Rapido RDCs, which are a good deal fancier than and more expensive than the Proto 1000s. They've done both the Phase 1 version on the left and the Phase 2 version, which you can see you can see the differences in the cab windows. The Pilot actually has a stainless steel guard, fairly solid, that goes down to keep things out from under the wheels. And the headlight has its own housing. And both of those run pretty well. I have had a mechanical problem with one, though. I, of course, had to buy more than one. But they look very nice, and you can buy them with sound. Now, there are some cars that were quite common, widely used. Maybe they were a regular on the train that you want to model, and you can't get them in plastic. You can't get them painted. What I'm showing on 3 of these cars were imported by Nickel Plate Products as part of a Mountaineer set, the New York, Ontario, and Western Mountaineer train that they imported in 1973. And because 2 of them are very good matches for Boston and Maine prototypes, they were built by Pullman Bradley or Osgood Bradley in Worcester, I watch out for those cars, and I have been able to get as many of them as I need that way. One piece of detail I have added is I've added a sill, which that car didn't come with, and there are a few other little things you can correct. But mostly what you have to do is paint them, and then all is well once you've painted them. The New Haven car, that is one that I don't run very often, but I happened to get that car, and I thought, well, I'll paint it up as New Haven. And then I have a kind of exotic thing. In the 70s, New Jersey Custom Brass brought in kits for a couple of different sleepers, and that's one that I built. They were brass, a bundle of pieces in a box with a preformed brass shell. That's one I built, and it came out pretty nice. Moving on to kits that you can build. Most people who are interested in the B&M are aware of the Laconia built, mostly open platform coaches and combines that they used in commuter service, because quite a few of them migrated to Strasbourg, and there are a couple at the National Railway Museum in St. Louis, and there are others elsewhere in tourist service because they were so quaint. They got steel underframes in the 20s, and they're still going strong at 110 years old now. That kit is wood. Ambroid and Northeastern offered both that was Northeastern scale models, not Northeastern scale lumber. Offered the kits for years, the coach and a 4 baggage door combine. The Bethlehem Car Works, under their Sparrows Point label, has offered newer versions of those kits, which I haven't built. But the Ambroid Northeastern car is a classic wood kit. If you haven't built one, or if you're familiar with them, it goes together like most of the others. The Bangor and Aroostook coach I built from an E&B Valley kit, which was flat molded and came out in the 70s also. And I did it that way because I did that rather than use the Rapido car, because I wanted to do the special Bangor and Aroostook underbody and roof details. Down in the lower left there is a Bethlehem Car Works kit that uses etched brass sides to do the B&M 4 baggage door steel combines that have that same 24 by 36 inch glass that the nickel plate products, New York, Ontario, and Western Car did. And then we have another Eastern Car Works flat styrene kit. The Eastern Car Works kind of inherited from E&B Valley. And that's a New Haven baggage parlor from the 1948 order. Something that serious passenger car modelers are going to get into one way or another is the concept of a car side specific to the car you want, assembled onto a core kit. I have some photos of how you do that later on. What I have here are sides that were made for B&M modelers by Concord Junction Car Shops, and 3 Eastern Car Works core kits, which I would never buy another Eastern Car Works core kit now that Train Station Products came out with a much better one. The last one is a sleeper, and I had that sleeper at the Syracuse convention, and it got a merit award. Not because it was all scratch built, but the interior I put in it. So now we're into the section of how do you figure out what it is you want to build if you want to represent a particular train. This one should be shooting fish in a barrel. The photographer has told you when and where and the number, which is actually hard to read on that version of the Canadian Pacific paint scheme. But there's kind of a question of what else can you learn from this? One thing is the paint scheme. That isn't the first Canadian Pacific RDC scheme. Second is that it's a Canadian Pacific RDC that ran down to North Station in Boston and is now going home. It has a rather different from factory horn on it. It has a different from factory headlight on it. And possibly, though we can't see it from this angle, it was rebuilt with a lunch counter in the baggage section because the Canadian Pacific wanted to be able to provide at least some meal service on what was a 6 or 7 hour run from Boston to Montreal. There were a lot of people of that era in Eastern Canada, Vermont, and Northern New Hampshire who needed to use the train because the highways hadn't gotten there yet. Here's a little more challenging image. I know it's Bellows Falls because I've seen pictures of that area before. I know it's early 1950s because there's a B&M RS2 hauling a passenger train, and that series of RS2s was built as freight only and only got their steam generators in the early 50s. And third, the New Haven American Flyer coach there has had its skirts removed over the trucks, but not between the trucks. And that tells you the era of the New Haven lightweight cars. They loved the skirts at the beginning, and then they came off when they were too expensive. So we've got two coaches here. One of them is obviously New Haven because I at least can read the New Haven lettering on it. And the American Flyer car is also New Haven because B&M American Flyer type cars never had any skirts. So they are coming south into Bellows Falls. The New Haven coach looks like it's been air conditioned, but probably just with ice activated because it looks like one of the passengers is hanging out the window. So this is a day train coming down and those two cars at least are going to change to a New Haven train at Springfield and go on to either Grand Central, most likely, or Penn Station. The coach, the heavyweight coach, is unlikely to be going through to Pennsylvania Railroad points. This image is a little more challenging. It's also taken in Bellows Falls. It's nicely dated, but we have four really distinctive passenger cars behind the engine. The first one, the baggage car, you might say, well, that's just a baggage car. How can I identify it? And I'm going to tell you that baggage car is long, and that baggage car has vestibules and steps. How did it arrive at that? Well, if you look it up, the B&M needed to get rid of a lot of old wood baggage cars that it had been using past World War II. They were no longer going to be allowed into Grand Central or Penn Station and in a number of other places. So they bought old Pullman sleepers, plated over the windows, cut baggage doors in, and that's what you see. It's an 85-foot baggage car with two 8-foot wide double doors and vestibules on both ends. Some of the sleepers they converted only had a vestibule on one end. And so that was the way the resulting baggage car wound up. The second car, if you look sharp, you'll notice that there is a mail catcher in that door. So that means, and the windows are a funny pattern, not seen in baggage cars. So what you have there is an RPO coach combine. And it was an RPO smoker combine, and the Rutland had a couple of them. And I don't think, they were a very uncommon car. So when you see that window layout, you know it's a Rutland car. The third car has that distinctive 24 by 36 inch window glazing. You can see how big it is compared to the Rutland car next to it. And so that's almost certainly one of the B&M's 4500 series high window coaches. They air condition some of them for this kind of service. The last car, all the way over to the right, has an arch roof, and it has those distinctive vents on it. So that is one of the cars the B&M bought from the Reading in either 1946 or 1952. So we've tagged what was on train 5503 on September of 1950. This is another one which local knowledge will help you. You've got a observation car, and it's on the B&M, and it says Canadian Pacific. Okay, that tells you it was the Canadian Pacific Buffet Parlor OBS, which was the only one that ran in New England in the 50s, and it is on its way to Boston. The second car has a distinctive shape, and the window spacing is the roof shape and the window spacing are really wrong for an American Flyer car. So what it is, you look around a little bit, the lettering you can guess might be Canadian Pacific. Okay, so that's one of the 2200 series lightweight coaches that Canadian Pacific had bought in the late 40s. The one ahead of it is also a car type the B&M didn't have. The baggage door in that location doesn't match any of the B&M heavyweight combines. So that's going to be another Canadian Pacific combine. And there's another car ahead of it, and if you look at other photographs of the Alouette, you'll know it's an RPO, and that was usually a B&M RPO. This is a tough one. I'm not going to spend too long on it because I can't expect most of you have much background in this. But here we've got on the left, we've got a B&M American Flyer car and one of the ex-Reading coaches, but with more vents than usual, probably set up for commuter service. In the train that's approaching, I see a coach with irregular height windows. Then I see two high window coaches, two of the 24 by 36 inch glass cars. Then I see a double door 60-foot baggage car. Can't tell whose it is at this distance. And then what might be another coach. I think I see a hint of windows there. In that case, that coach would have been deadheading because they would put it ahead of the baggage car. So looking at my watch, I find that time has been passing. And it's about time I did these last two pictures. This shows how I installed the roof conduits and rain gutters on one of those Bethlehem Car Works Reading kits. That the conduit was for train lighting. The B&M did head-end power way before most other railroads, but it was low voltage. The locomotive powered the lights in the commuter cars. I use Walther's glue when I'm trying to make a metal to plastic joint because it's not brittle. I add weight to my cars by hammering lead tire weights to fit inside the center sills. That keeps them inconspicuous. This is how I built that brass side plastic roof kit there. I did some things with solder, which the instructions said I should do with ACC. But then again, the baggage door steps have never come off. And that car's been in train show service for 20 years, thereabouts. This last slide is a summary of who makes the sides that you can put on the core kits and a few notes about it. This is not something to undertake as your first kit build. It's something that you should do when you have some experience, but you can produce pretty good work doing it that way. Union Station Products is active now. I think Athabasca Car Shops is still active. I know an NKP Car Company is still active, but Concord Junction Car Shops hasn't made sides this decade. There's something you see at train shows. This is how you assemble them all. I use styrene strips held onto the back of the metal sides with Walther's glue, and then I assemble those styrene strips to the rest of the body with regular styrene cement, just like you were doing an all-plastic kit. And now I'm ready for questions. And for that, I think I have to go back to our goodly hosts.
All right, James, that's great. And comments in the chat say this was a very informative and really cool clinic. And we do have a few questions. You ready?
I am.
Okay. All right. Let's see. What have I got here? One question was, were there ever any electrified locomotives pulling passenger trains in New England? And I think they meant sort of outside of the New York City area. In upstate New England, were there ever any electrics?
Well, everybody knows that essentially all New Haven passenger service between New Haven and the New York City terminals was hauled by electric locomotives until the New Haven bought the FL9s. North of Waterbury, Connecticut, the only place where passenger trains were hauled electrically was Hoosac Tunnel, where until 1946 they would put one of the 11,000 volt electric motors, which happened to be almost exactly like the New Haven ZF1, on the head end of a passenger train ahead of its steam locomotive, pull it through the tunnel while the steam locomotive's fires were banked, and then cut it off at the others in North Adams or at East Portal in the tunnel. The only actual electric operation of passenger cars, MU, was on the Boston Revere Beach and Lynn, and that was 3-foot gauge. And if you want to do exotic narrow gauge modeling, doing 3-foot narrow gauge open platform wood cars under catenary with trolley poles hauling commuters is not going to be yet another Colorado model.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's an interesting railroad line. No question. No question. Hey, you mentioned also the troop sleepers and how those got kind of spread around to the various New England railroads. Are any of those still around and used in any way?
I don't believe any troop sleepers still exist aside from perhaps at museums.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't gone and dug them up. I know a number of the Bangor and Aroostook troop sleeper cabooses survived to the end of cabooses on the BAR, and some of them may have been preserved. I've seen photos, but since they haven't been a modeling priority for me, let's see. Actually, there were B&M ones that existed into the 80s, and I think some of them may be at Railroad Museum of New England. But that's a place that, even though it's only 4 or 5 hours drive away, I have never visited it.
Where is that Railroad Museum of New England?
It's on the Housatonic line, so it's out near Waterbury, but I don't know the exact town.
Okay. Okay.
If I'd been there, I would. I could look it up, but then again, so could anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you planted the seed. Somebody asked if there's much color photography from the steam area in any of the resources that you mentioned?
The books that I mentioned around Boston with Carl Byron in color, all the photos in them are in color. And they are selected pretty well because the B&M ran steam till 1956. The photographers gathered and they brought their best film. They were shooting diesels in black and white, and they were shooting steam in color because they knew it was doomed.
Huh. Interesting. Interesting. So if you were kind of a newer modeler and was just kind of getting into passenger cars, would would you recommend how would you recommend going about this? Would you like try to model a fleet in general, say the B&M had these kinds of cars, or would you pick a specific train like you showed pictures of the Alouette and others and model them train by train?
That for the way it'd work with my brain, if I was working on a modular layout, if I didn't have a layout at home, I would probably build some trains. And that's why I have cars in my fleet of passenger cars, which never really operated on the place where I modeled it with my layout, but I bring them out for operation on the hub division modules because, there I can do a Connecticut River train or a train bound for the Hoosac Tunnel and New York State. But what ran on the Eastern Railroad was a little bit more limited.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, it's doing a specific train is a good way of having diversity. And in a small fleet, it's diverse, and there are a lot of different things you can do. depending on the train you decide is interesting.
Right.
When I did the eastern route here on my layout, I had to build the same commuter cars, several different instances of them repeated, because I was going to have more than one commuter train. And that only really starts to look good to me when I have 5 or 6 people here operating my layout with me.
Mm. So that they're all being used then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you made me think of something, because I'm a modular railroader too. And when you kind of think about the world that way in modulars and train show layouts and such, you do tend to think in terms of trains, I think. Full
Yeah.
trains from front to back. Interesting. Interesting. Let's see, what else have I got here? Are there are there some specific ways that New England passenger trains and equipment were significantly different than it was in other places of the country?
Mostly it was the diversity. The B&M was running equipment that went from brand new to built in 1902
Hmm.
in the early 50s. And if you went to North Station, you would see B&M equipment, Maine Central equipment, Canadian National, Central Vermont, Canadian Pacific, Bangor and Aroostook. If you went out to the station at Ayer, where the Worcester line and the Worcester to Portland line and the Boston to Troy, New York line crossed, you'd see sleeper trains and camp trains hauling kids to the camps in Maine. You'd see the State of Maine Express hauling mail baggage and whatever. You'd see mail and express trains going to interchange with the New York Central, which was the power in express handling in New England. They brought most of it in because it came right into the big center in Springfield on the Great Steel Fleet. And
Hmm.
it's diverse.
A
You
lot of
wouldn't see all the same cars. You wouldn't see all the same locomotives. There were a lot of special moves.
interesting.
And also most of the lines that weren't real, tag along branch lines, they had more than 4 trains a day. They had 6, 8. The ones in the commuter district had many more.
Yeah.
So if you, often the thing that someone's talking about when they're talking about the setting for a small to medium sized layout, there might be 1 or 2 passenger trains a day over their line, or maybe none if they're modeling something that just didn't have passenger service.
Right. Right.
But the passenger service, to me, throws something into the operations mix also, because they're running to a timetable. And the freight crews, the classic thing that if you've ever been lucky enough to ride with a freight crew, they're always thinking about how they can get their work done and get back. And in passenger territory, that means getting their work done and following the rules and getting clear of all the passenger trains.
Yeah. 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 I had the pleasure of riding a Amtrak train recently, and today it's all exactly the opposite. The Amtrak train has to keep getting out of the way for the freights that are making
The FRA just published rules which say the passenger trains have some standing.
Huh.
Remains to be seen if they'll get enforced, but there are rules now.
If I were to parachute into one of these lines in the transition era, and I'm thinking specifically of the B&M or the New Haven, and I watch trains go by, what what percentage of like baggage cars would be from other lines passing through New England versus branded in either of those two? You know what I mean?
The only service where you'd see all B&M or mostly B&M were the trains that handled magazines and catalogs being printed in Concord, New Hampshire, and distributed all over the area. They tended to use their own cars. What came in by way of the New York Central from points west, I don't think much mail, some mail and express moved through Penn Station, but much more of it came in over the Hudson River Bridge. you would see all kinds of railroads. I've seen Missouri Pacific, I've seen Florida East Coast. It's the cars moved in kind of a pool, and there wasn't a major incentive to get them home instantly. They would come here and they would go home when they were loaded, but maybe they'd get used for a trip here if that was what was available.
So that's always good news for a modeler, right? Gives you a lot of license to throw in baggage.
Yeah, that's why I led with the B60 and the RB50, because Penzi was big and they were everywhere.
Excellent. One last question here, and I'm not sure exactly what the specific is, but there's a question. What about the commuter? Do you know anything about a commuter train that runs from Boston to Gloucester? That's the question. I don't know if that's.
I've ridden it. I know what it was equipped with in the 50s. I know what it was equipped with in the 60s. I know what it was equipped with in the 70s. I know what it was equipped with in the 80s. In this era, it was RS3s, GP7s, BL2s, hauling the kind of coaches that I showed in my presentation.
Okay.
That's in about 1953 to 1955. Then by 1956, it was mostly, but by 1956, I think it was all Bud cars, 1957 at least, and it stayed Bud cars until 1978. And then the Bud cars had their motor covers left off for the blizzard of 78, and they then had to be hauled by GP7s, and that persisted for a while. And then you started seeing purple MBTA painted equipment.
We're at the end of the road here, but I'm going to invite anybody else who has a question to reach out for you directly. You've obviously stirred up a lot of interest in passenger trains.
I am the only person. I'm the only person with my name in the world at this time, so I'm easy to find.
Well, very good, James. Thanks so much for sharing a great clinic with us today, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon again.
Thanks for being the audience. I hope I talked okay with nobody to see at all.
Awesome job. Bye now.